Have you ever wondered what it would be like to read the entire Old Testament, seeing how every story fits together like one grand life-changing puzzle? Sure, you've heard about creation, the flood, the Exodus, but what if I told you that when you see these events in sequence, everything starts to make sense in a way you've never imagined? There's a hidden thread running through the Old Testament that not only reveals God's incredible plan for His people, but also has the power to transform the way you see your life today. Most people miss this because they've never seen the bigger picture. But here's the exciting part. As we walk through this story together, piece by piece, you'll start to uncover truths that have been right in front of you the whole time. And let me tell you, if you stick with me until the end of this video, I've got a surprising revelation waiting for you that's going to completely shift how you think about these ancient stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. So, buckle up. In this journey through the Old Testament, you're not just going to learn history, you're going to unlock the meaning behind it all. From the creation of the world to the return from exile, each event is part of a larger narrative, leading to something that will change how you live with purpose, faith, and hope. And I promise, by the end of this video, you'll see the Old Testament in a way that will leave you amazed. In the very beginning, everything was dark, empty, and void. But God had a plan. He spoke, and with His words, the heavens and the earth came into existence. Light split the darkness, seas formed, and land appeared. God didn't stop there. He filled the world with all sorts of life, from plants to animals, each with its unique purpose. Imagine standing on a beach, the sunset painting the sky in a myriad of colors. It's hard not to see the beauty in creation. Every element had a place, a role, just as we do today. Humanity was the pinnacle of God's creation. When He crafted Adam and Eve, He made them in His own image, giving them dominion over the earth. They weren't just physical beings, they were spiritual ones too, capable of relationship, love, and creativity, echoes of God's own nature. Think of the responsibility that comes with such a gift. It's not just about living life day by day. It's about understanding our purpose here, much like a gardener tending to their plants, knowing that each one serves a unique role in the garden. The world we live in today, filled with cities, technology, and noise, is far from the simplicity of the first creation. But the same principles of order, beauty, and purpose still apply. Just as God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it, we are called to tend to the world around us. Whether it's our work, relationships, or the environment, everything needs our attention and care. However, creation wasn't just about what was made. It was also about rest. After 6 days of creating, God rested on the seventh, establishing a rhythm of work and rest for all humanity. If we don't take the time to rest, how can we reflect on what we've achieved? It's like planting seeds without pausing to water them. Eventually, nothing grows. This cycle of creating, tending, and resting is still relevant today, a rhythm that sustains life. Everything in the Garden of Eden was perfect. Adam and Eve had everything they needed. Yet temptation found its way into paradise. The serpent, cunning and persuasive, whispered doubt into their ears. Did God really say you can't eat from this tree? It's a question that resonates even today, doesn't it? The moment we begin to question, to doubt, our sense of clarity fades. Adam and Eve, like many of us, were drawn in, desiring the very thing they were told to avoid. The forbidden fruit wasn't just about food, it was a test of trust. When Eve took that bite and shared it with Adam, they both chose self-reliance over obedience. Suddenly, the world changed, innocence was lost, and with it came shame and fear. You know that sinking feeling when you realize you've messed up. It's like when you break something valuable and there's no way to fix it. That's what they felt, knowing they had introduced sin into a perfect world. The consequences of their choice were immediate. They hid from God, covering themselves, a symbol of how we all try to hide our mistakes. It's easy to see this pattern in our lives today. When we make wrong choices, don't we often try to cover them up, hoping no one will notice? But like with Adam and Eve, the consequences catch up. They were cast out of the garden, facing a harsh world. This wasn't just a punishment. It was the beginning of humanity's long journey back to redemption. And yet, even in their failure, God didn't abandon them. He provided clothes for their nakedness, a sign that His care hadn't ended. This part of the story speaks volumes about grace. Mistakes are inevitable, but they don't have to define us. It's like falling down while learning to ride a bike. The important part is that we get back up. In the same way, even though Adam and Eve's fall brought sin into the world, it also set the stage for the ultimate redemption through Jesus. The story of Cain and Abel is a powerful reflection of human emotions, jealousy, anger, and ultimately, tragedy. Cain and Abel were the first children of Adam and Eve, but their paths diverged dramatically. Abel, a shepherd, offered the best of his flock to God, while Cain, a farmer, offered crops. Yet, it wasn't the type of offering that mattered. It was the heart behind it. Abel's offering was accepted because it came from a place of devotion, but Cain's, filled with resentment, was rejected. Isn't that how life often works? It's not just about what we do, but the intention behind it. Cain's jealousy boiled over, leading him to commit the first murder. He lured Abel into the fields and killed him. It's a chilling reminder of how unchecked emotions can spiral out of control. Cain's anger wasn't just directed at Abel. It was also against God, for accepting Abel's offering and rejecting his. Have you ever found yourself frustrated when someone else's efforts seem more recognized? It's a human tendency, but it can lead us down dangerous paths if we don't manage those feelings. After the act, Cain's guilt and shame were overwhelming, but instead of owning his actions, he tried to deny them. When God asked, "Where is your brother?" Cain's infamous reply was, "Am I my brother's keeper?" His words echo through time, a reminder of our responsibility toward others. It's easy to disconnect from the needs and pains of those around us, but as this story illustrates, we are meant to care for one another, not harm each other. Despite the enormity of Cain's sin, God didn't destroy him. Instead, he marked Cain, ensuring that no one would kill him in revenge. This was both a punishment and a form of protection, a balance between justice and mercy. It's a profound lesson that even when we fail, there is still room for redemption. In today's world, where conflicts can feel overwhelming, the story of Cain and Abel reminds us to guard our hearts and to seek reconciliation instead of destruction. As generations passed after Cain and Abel, the world became more populated, but it also grew more corrupt. Humanity drifted further from God's ways, indulging in wickedness and violence. It's a sobering thought. How quickly society can fall into moral decay when people prioritize selfish desires over righteousness. The Bible says that every thought of man's heart was evil continually. Can you imagine a world where there's no kindness, no compassion, just cruelty? Unfortunately, we don't have to look far to see echoes of this in our world today. This period of human history teaches us a valuable lesson about the consequences of unchecked corruption. It's like watching a garden overrun by weeds. Without intervention, the beauty is choked out. People stopped caring about others, and injustice became the norm. The moral compass had completely shattered, and with it, humanity's ability to see the bigger picture. Have you ever noticed how easily a small wrong can snowball into something much bigger if no one steps in? That's what happened here. Evil had become the status quo. God, seeing the devastation of sin, regretted creating humanity and decided to reset the world through a flood. But even in his anger, there was a glimmer of hope. Noah found favor in God's eyes, a single man who still walked in righteousness amid a corrupt world. This teaches us that even when things seem dark, there's always room for hope. It's like being the lone candle in a room of darkness. The light may be small, but it can guide others out of the gloom. Noah's story reminds us that one person can make a difference. However, the impending flood wasn't just a punishment. It was a way to cleanse and start anew. God wasn't giving up on humanity altogether. The reset was meant to restore balance, to offer a fresh start in our lives. We sometimes need a similar reset, a moment to reflect, clear out what's not working, and begin again. It's not easy, but like the flood, it can be a necessary step toward renewal. Noah's story is one of extraordinary faith. Imagine being told to build a massive ark because a flood is coming, even when there's no sign of rain. People must have thought he was crazy. Yet, Noah obeyed God's instructions without hesitation, gathering his family and pairs of animals into the ark. It's a perfect example of trusting the process, even when the outcome seems far-fetched. In life, we often find ourselves in situations where we're asked to take a leap of faith, even when others doubt us. Noah's obedience teaches us that when we follow God's path, even against the odds, the reward is greater than we can imagine. When the rains finally came, it wasn't just a drizzle. It was a deluge that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, covering the earth and wiping out all life outside the ark. Inside, though, Noah and his family were safe, a reminder of God's protection. It's much like the storms we face in life. While everything around us may seem chaotic, if we've prepared and stayed true to our principles, we can weather even the most challenging times. The ark symbolizes that refuge, a safe place amid the flood of problems we sometimes face. After the rains ceased and the waters began to recede, Noah sent out a dove to see if the land was dry. When the dove returned with an olive branch, it was a sign that the flood had ended and that life would begin again. That moment of seeing the olive branch must have been filled with relief and hope. In many ways, it's similar to the small signs we look for in our own lives when we're going through a tough season. A bit of good news, a breakthrough, or a glimmer of change. It's a reminder that the storm doesn't last forever. Once the floodwaters fully receded, Noah, his family, and the animals exited the ark to a cleansed earth. God made a covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy the world by flood again, and setting a rainbow in the sky as a symbol of this promise. The rainbow is more than just a beautiful sight. It's a reminder of God's mercy and faithfulness. Even after judgment, there is grace. And in our lives, after every storm, there's the promise of renewal, of starting fresh, and of finding beauty again. After the flood, the earth was a blank slate, cleansed of the corruption that had overtaken it. Noah and his family stepped out of the ark, probably with a mix of relief and uncertainty. The world they knew was gone, and they were tasked with repopulating the earth and starting anew. It's a powerful metaphor for second chances, isn't it? Life sometimes knocks us down, but there's always an opportunity to rebuild, to begin again with lessons learned. Think of it like a reset button, not a complete erasure, but a chance to grow stronger from the experience. God made a covenant with Noah, a binding promise that never again would he destroy the earth by flood. And as a sign of this covenant, God set a rainbow in the sky. The rainbow, which we still see today after storms, serves as a visual reminder of God's faithfulness. Every time we see one, it's as if God is whispering, "I remember my promise." In a world full of broken promises, the certainty of God's word stands out. How often do we cling to that certainty when everything around us feels uncertain? That's what Noah and his family had to hold on to. Noah's first act upon leaving the ark was to build an altar and offer sacrifices to God, thanking him for their survival. This act of worship is a key lesson in gratitude. When we come out of difficult times, it's easy to forget to give thanks for what we've been spared from. But Noah shows us that gratitude is essential, even in moments of great transition. It's much like how we should approach our lives, pausing after challenges to reflect and give thanks, recognizing the role faith plays in our survival. The covenant between God and Noah wasn't just about survival. It was about a new beginning. God blessed Noah and his sons, telling them to be fruitful and multiply, filling the earth once more. The post-flood world was theirs to cultivate, much like Adam and Eve's task in the beginning. It's a reminder that every ending is the start of something new, whether in work, relationships, or personal growth. When one chapter closes, another begins, often with the opportunity to apply all we've learned from the storms we've weathered. After the flood, humanity began to grow again, and with it came new ambitions. People were united by a single language, which gave them the ability to work together on grand projects. One such project was the Tower of Babel, a massive structure meant to reach the heavens. The goal, to make a name for themselves and prevent being scattered across the earth. It's fascinating how quickly the human heart can drift toward pride, isn't it? Even after the flood, they still sought power and control, aiming to reach heaven on their own terms, rather than through a relationship with God. The building of the tower wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It symbolized humanity's desire for independence from God. Instead of spreading out as God had commanded, they wanted to centralize, to create their own security. How often do we do the same thing? We build figurative towers in our lives, relying on our own efforts, our own strength, rather than seeking guidance from above. But as we see in the story, such endeavors, driven by pride, rarely stand the test of time. God, seeing their prideful ambition, decided to intervene. He confused their languages, making it impossible for them to communicate effectively. Imagine the chaos. One moment, they're all working in harmony, and the next, no one can understand each other. The project came to an abrupt halt, and the people were scattered across the earth, just as God had originally intended. It's a stark reminder that when we try to force our own plans, especially those built on pride, things can quickly fall apart. The best laid plans often crumble when they're not aligned with a greater purpose. In the end, the Tower of Babel became a symbol of human limitation. No matter how advanced or united people are, without God's direction, their efforts will ultimately fail. This story leaves us with a valuable lesson about humility and obedience. We can plan, work hard, and build great things, but it's crucial to keep our hearts in check. Are we doing it for ourselves, or are we honoring something greater? The scattering of people and the introduction of diverse languages also set the stage for the many cultures and nations we see in the world today. Another reminder that even in what seems like chaos, there is a divine plan at work. The story of the patriarchs begins with Abraham, a man chosen by God to become the father of a great nation. Abraham's journey of faith is one of the most remarkable in the Bible. When God told him to leave his home and go to a land he would show him, Abraham obeyed without knowing where he was going. It's that kind of faith, the willingness to step into the unknown, that sets Abraham apart. In our own lives, how often are we willing to take that kind of leap of faith? Whether it's starting a new job or pursuing a dream, trusting in a bigger plan requires courage. Abraham's son Isaac and his grandson Jacob continued this legacy of faith, each playing a key role in God's unfolding promise. Isaac, though quieter in the biblical narrative, carried the covenant forward. He, too, experienced moments where faith was tested, like when he was almost sacrificed by his father. Jacob, on the other hand, had a more tumultuous journey. His life was filled with deception, wrestling both figuratively and literally. Remember the night he wrestled with an angel? But through it all, God's promise remained. The patriarchs show us that faith isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance. These stories are rich with lessons about family, relationships, and the pursuit of God's promises. Abraham's story teaches us about the importance of listening to God's call, even when it's difficult to leave behind what's comfortable. Isaac's story shows us the quiet strength of faith in the face of uncertainty. And Jacob's life is a reminder that even when we make mistakes, even when we struggle with our own nature, there is redemption. It's like the process of refining gold. There's struggle and heat, but in the end, something precious emerges. The patriarchs laid the foundation for the nation of Israel, and through their lives, we see the unfolding of God's covenant with his people. The promises made to Abraham were passed down through Isaac and Jacob, eventually leading to the 12 tribes of Israel. Their stories remind us that God's plans are often generational, much bigger than what we can see in the moment. It's a humbling thought. Our actions, our faith, can ripple through generations, impacting lives we may never meet. The patriarchs remind us that we are part of something bigger than ourselves, a story that continues to unfold through time. God's promise to Abraham was more than just a blessing. It was the start of a divine covenant that would shape the future of an entire nation. God told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that through him, all nations would be blessed. Imagine being told something so grand, so beyond comprehension. Abraham had no children at the time, yet he believed God's words. It's a powerful reminder of faith in the unseen. How often do we find ourselves in situations where the promise seems impossible? Yet, Abraham's story shows us that faith isn't about what we see, but about trusting in what we've been told. The promise wasn't just about numbers, though. It was about legacy. Abraham's life wasn't perfect, but God's commitment to him never wavered. Even when Abraham and his wife Sarah doubted that they could have children in their old age, God remained faithful. This reminds us that delays aren't denials. Sometimes, the promises in our lives take time to unfold. It's like planting a seed. We don't see the growth immediately, but that doesn't mean nothing is happening beneath the surface. Patience, much like Abraham's, is key. When Isaac was finally born, it was a miracle that reaffirmed God's faithfulness. Isaac represented more than just the fulfillment of a personal promise to Abraham and Sarah. He was the beginning of a nation, the The birth of Isaac showed that no matter how improbable something may seem, God's promises never fail. It's a lesson we can apply in our own lives. When we face moments of doubt, we can look back at the times when things seemed impossible, yet turned out better than we could have imagined. Those moments build our faith, just as Isaac's birth did for Abraham. Abraham's journey also teaches us about the cost of faith. God tested him in one of the most profound ways, asking him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. Abraham's willingness to follow through, even though it seemed to contradict the promise, showed his complete trust in God. And just as Abraham was about to act, God provided a ram in Isaac's place. This act was a foreshadowing of future redemption, pointing to a much larger promise fulfilled through Jesus. It shows us that God's plan is always for our good, even when it challenges us to our core. The story of Ishmael and Isaac highlights the complexities of human decisions intertwined with divine plans. Ishmael, born to Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, came into the world because Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands. They doubted God's promise of a child through Sarah and thought they needed to help God fulfill it. It's something we can all relate to, isn't it? How often do we rush into our own solutions when we feel God's timing is too slow? But this decision set in motion a family conflict that would last generations. When Isaac, the promised son, was born to Sarah, the tension between the two sons became even more apparent. Ishmael, being older, mocked Isaac, creating a rift that led to Hagar and Ishmael being sent away. It's a difficult story to read, but it reflects the consequences of impatience and mistrust. God, however, didn't abandon Ishmael. He promised to make a great nation of him as well, showing his mercy and grace even when we make mistakes. This reminds us that while our choices can create conflict, God's grace is big enough to cover them. Ishmael's descendants became a great nation, just as God had promised. But the division between Isaac and Ishmael's line would echo through history, affecting not only their immediate family but entire nations. It's a lesson in the far-reaching consequences of our actions. What starts as a small decision can have ripple effects far beyond what we can see. That's why trusting God's timing is so critical. When we try to force things, we may get immediate results, but those results often come with unforeseen complications. Yet, through it all, God's promise to Abraham stood firm. Isaac was the child of the covenant, and through him, the promise of a great nation would continue. The story of Ishmael and Isaac serves as a reminder that while human mistakes can complicate the path, they can't derail God's ultimate plan. It's comforting to know that even when we take detours, God is faithful to guide us back to his purpose. Whether we relate more to Ishmael, feeling cast aside, or Isaac, born of promise, the story shows that God's grace extends to all. The story of Jacob and Esau is one filled with tension, deception, and eventually, reconciliation. As twin brothers, their conflict began even before birth, with the Bible describing them wrestling in their mother's womb. Esau, the firstborn, was entitled to the family birthright, but Jacob, whose name means supplanter, was determined to take it for himself. This rivalry is something many can relate to: competition between siblings, vying for attention, or trying to outdo one another. But in Jacob's case, the stakes were incredibly high, as the birthright carried not just material wealth, but also spiritual blessings. Jacob's deceitful nature came to the forefront when he tricked his father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing meant for Esau. Disguising himself as his brother, he received the blessing of the firstborn, setting off a series of events that would lead to years of separation and bitterness between the two. Have you ever made a choice that seemed clever at the moment but later realized it brought more problems than solutions? That's exactly what happened with Jacob. His manipulation led to him fleeing for his life, leaving behind a broken relationship with his brother. Years later, after building his own family and wealth, Jacob prepared to meet Esau again. Unsure of how his brother would respond, Jacob feared revenge. But in an unexpected twist, Esau welcomed Jacob with open arms, showing that time and perhaps divine intervention had healed the rift. This reconciliation teaches us the power of forgiveness. No matter how deep the hurt, there's always hope for healing. It's like that moment when you finally make peace with someone you've wronged or who has wronged you. The weight is lifted, and something new can grow from the ashes of past conflict. But in an unexpected twist, Esau welcomed Jacob with open arms, showing that time, and perhaps divine intervention, had healed the rift. This reconciliation teaches us the power of forgiveness. No matter how deep the hurt, there's always hope for healing. It's like that moment when you finally make peace with someone you've wronged or who has wronged you. The weight is lifted, and something new can grow from the ashes of past conflict. Jacob's journey didn't just involve reconciliation with Esau. It was also a journey of transformation. Before meeting his brother, Jacob wrestled with an angel, and it was in this struggle that he was given a new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. This moment symbolized Jacob's personal growth, from a deceiver to a man of faith. It's a reminder that our past mistakes don't define our future. We can change, and in that change, we find new purpose. The story of Jacob and Esau isn't just about sibling rivalry. It's about redemption and the possibility of becoming more than our past actions. Joseph's story is one of incredible highs and devastating lows, but ultimately, it's about resilience and divine purpose. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, which naturally stirred jealousy among his brothers. Jacob even gave Joseph a special coat of many colors, a symbol of his favoritism. This didn't sit well with his brothers, and when Joseph began having dreams that predicted his future rise above them, their envy turned to hatred. Jealousy can drive people to do terrible things, and this story shows how unchecked emotions can lead to destructive actions. Joseph's brothers plotted to get rid of him. Initially, they planned to kill him, but instead, they threw him into a pit and eventually sold him into slavery. Imagine the betrayal Joseph must have felt, abandoned by his own flesh and blood. It's a feeling many of us can relate to in different ways, being hurt by those closest to us. Yet, even in this dire situation, Joseph's faith didn't waver. This teaches us a powerful lesson. When life seems to take an unexpected, painful turn, holding on to faith can guide us through the darkest times. Despite being sold into slavery and later imprisoned in Egypt due to false accusations, Joseph's story is one of divine providence. He rose from a prisoner to become second in command to Pharaoh, interpreting dreams that foretold of a coming famine. Joseph's ability to see beyond his circumstances, to use his God-given gifts, even in hardship, is something we can all aspire to. How often do we let adversity define us? Joseph shows us that setbacks can be setups for something greater, especially when we maintain integrity and faith. In a remarkable turn of events, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food during the famine, not realizing that the powerful man before them was the brother they had betrayed. Rather than seeking revenge, Joseph forgave them, saying, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." His ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that even the worst moments of his life had a divine purpose, is inspiring. Joseph's story reminds us that forgiveness, even in the face of deep hurt, can lead to healing and restoration. It's not just about letting go. It's about recognizing that every twist and turn in life can serve a greater good. Joseph's story continues as he welcomes his family to Egypt during a time of severe famine. After revealing his identity to his brothers, he invites them, and eventually his father, Jacob, to come to Egypt where he can provide for them. It's an incredible act of reconciliation and grace, considering the pain they had caused him. Joseph's rise to power wasn't just about his personal success. It positioned him to save not only Egypt, but also his entire family. This shows us that sometimes our blessings aren't just for us. They're meant to bless others as well. The migration to Egypt wasn't just a family reunion. It was the beginning of a significant chapter in the history of Israel. 70 members of Jacob's family moved to Egypt, and this is where the Israelites would grow into a mighty nation. It's fascinating to see how God used the famine in Joseph's position to bring his people to the place where they would later be freed in the Exodus. What looks like a simple act of survival, moving to Egypt to escape starvation, was actually part of a much bigger divine plan. It's a reminder that even our most practical decisions can have spiritual significance. As Jacob's family settled in Egypt, they were given the land of Goshen, one of the most fertile areas in the country. Joseph's favor with Pharaoh ensured that his family was well taken care of. But it wasn't just about the material comfort. They were also being set apart in a foreign land. This idea of being set apart would echo throughout the rest of the Bible, as the Israelites were always meant to be distinct, a people chosen by God, even in a land that wasn't their own. God's hand was guiding them, just as He guides us in unfamiliar places and seasons of life. The migration to Egypt was also the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. It may not have looked like a blessing at first, leaving their homeland during a famine, but it was the beginning of something much greater. Sometimes what seems like a detour or a difficult transition is actually the path to a promise. Just as Jacob's family found refuge in Egypt, we often find that the places we're led to, even when unexpected, are where we grow and prosper the most. The Exodus is one of the most powerful and iconic stories in the Bible, a moment when God demonstrated His ability to liberate His people from oppression. After generations of living in Egypt, the Israelites had grown into a large population. But with that growth came fear from the Egyptians. The new Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph, enslaved the Israelites, forcing them into harsh labor. For over 400 years, they endured this oppression, crying out to God for deliverance. It's a reminder that even in our longest seasons of struggle, God hears and answers in His timing. Moses, an unlikely leader raised in Pharaoh's household, was chosen by God to lead His people out of Egypt. His journey from the palace to the desert and back again to confront Pharaoh is nothing short of miraculous. It's a story of redemption and calling. Moses didn't believe he was capable, but God empowered him to stand up to the most powerful ruler in the world. This speaks to the moments in our lives when we feel inadequate, when the task seems too big. Moses reminds us that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. The actual event of the Exodus, when the Israelites were finally freed from slavery, wasn't just a political or social movement, it was a spiritual liberation. The plagues God sent upon Egypt were signs of His power, but also of His desire to free His people, not just physically, but spiritually. Leaving Egypt wasn't just about escaping slavery, it was about entering into a new covenant with God. Have you ever felt stuck in a place, physically or emotionally, and sensed that it's time to move forward? The Exodus shows that sometimes breaking free from what holds us back is the first step toward stepping into our true purpose. Crossing the Red Sea was the defining moment of the Exodus. When the Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the sea, it seemed like an impossible situation. But Moses, with God's power, parted the sea, allowing the people to walk through on dry ground. This wasn't just a miraculous event. It was a message that God makes a way where there seems to be no way. It's a powerful image of faith, trusting that even when we face obstacles, God can clear the path and lead us to freedom. The 10 plagues of Egypt were a direct confrontation between God's power and Pharaoh's stubbornness. Each plague was more than just a random act of destruction. It was a message to both the Egyptians and the Israelites that the God of Israel was supreme over all creation. From turning the Nile to blood to sending a hailstorm, God demonstrated His control over nature. These plagues weren't just punishments, they were warnings, opportunities for Pharaoh to change his heart and let the Israelites go. But as we see, when pride and power are at stake, even the clearest signs can be ignored. Each plague targeted a specific aspect of Egyptian life, many of which were tied to their gods. For example, the Nile turning to blood struck at the heart of their economy and religious beliefs, as the river was seen as a source of life and divine favor. The plague of darkness challenged their worship of the sun god, Ra. It's fascinating to see how God used the plagues to show that He was not just a regional deity, but the true ruler of all. In our own lives, how often do we hold on to things that we think give us control or security, only to find out that they pale in comparison to God's authority? Pharaoh's refusal to let the Israelites go, despite the growing severity of the plagues, reflects the human tendency to resist change, even when it's clearly necessary. His heart was hardened, a tragic example of how power can blind us to what's right. We see this in many aspects of life, people clinging to systems or habits that are destructive, simply because they can't imagine letting go. It's a reminder that sometimes the most difficult battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Letting go of control, pride, or fear is often the first step toward true freedom. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, was the most devastating and marked the turning point in the story. This event, remembered as Passover, was a pivotal moment for the Israelites, as God provided a way for them to be spared through the blood of a lamb. This points directly to the future sacrifice of Jesus, often referred to as the Lamb of God. The Passover wasn't just about physical survival, it was about deliverance, a foreshadowing of the ultimate salvation that would come through Christ. This final plague broke Pharaoh's will, and the Israelites were finally set free, showing us that even in the darkest moments, deliverance is always possible. The crossing of the Red Sea is one of the most dramatic and miraculous moments in the Bible. After Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt, he quickly regretted his decision and sent his army to pursue them. The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's advancing army and the seemingly impassable Red Sea. Panic set in as the people feared they were about to be destroyed. It's a moment many of us can relate to, feeling cornered by life's challenges, with no apparent way out. But what happens next is a powerful reminder that when we reach the end of our own strength, God can make a way. Moses, following God's command, stretched out his staff over the sea, and the waters parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to walk through. Imagine the awe they must have felt. Walking between two towering walls of water, this was more than just a physical escape. It was a declaration of God's power and faithfulness. In our own lives, when we face what seem like insurmountable obstacles, this story encourages us to trust that God can provide a path where none seems to exist. It's not always easy to see that path when we're in the middle of a crisis, but the Red Sea reminds us to hold on to faith. As the Israelites crossed safely, Pharaoh's army followed, but the waters returned, drowning the Egyptians. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a moment of complete deliverance for the Israelites. Their enemy, who had oppressed them for generations, was finally defeated. There's something deeply reassuring in this story about how God not only delivers us from difficult situations, but also removes the threats that once loomed large over our lives. Just as the Israelites were free from Egypt after the crossing, we too can find freedom from the things that hold us back when we walk in faith. This moment set the stage for the Israelites' new journey as a free people. The Red Sea crossing wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. On the other side of the sea, the Israelites could start fresh, knowing that the God who parted the waters was with them. It's a beautiful metaphor for the challenges we face in life. Often, the hardest moments, when we feel like we're walking through deep waters, are the ones that lead to new beginnings and greater freedom. The story of the Red Sea is a reminder that what may feel like the end could be the beginning of something far greater. The Ten Commandments represent a pivotal moment in the relationship between God and His people. After delivering the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, God brought them to Mount Sinai, where He gave them the laws that would define their moral and spiritual life. These weren't just rules for the sake of order, they were guidelines for living in harmony with God and with each other. Imagine receiving a direct set of instructions from God Himself. These commandments were meant to be the foundation of a just and righteous society. In a way, they're like a moral compass, guiding us to live with integrity and purpose. The first few commandments focus on the relationship between the Israelites and God, putting God first, avoiding idols, and honoring His name. These principles still resonate today, as they remind us that our relationship with God is the cornerstone of everything else. When we make something else, whether it's success, money, or even relationships, our ultimate focus, we stray from the path He set for us. The commandments serve as a reminder to keep our priorities in check, focusing on what truly matters. The latter commandments are about how we treat others, touching on issues like honoring parents, avoiding murder, theft, and adultery, and living truthfully. It's a clear outline for building a society based on respect, trust, and justice. Think about how much conflict could be avoided if these basic principles were followed today. The Ten Commandments teach us that morality isn't just about personal faith. It's about creating a community where everyone can thrive. Even today, these principles form the bedrock of many legal systems and continue to shape our understanding of right and wrong. The moment Moses came down from Mount Sinai, holding the stone tablets inscribed with the commandments, was more than just a historical event. It was a divine moment of covenant. The Israelites weren't just receiving laws, they were being invited into a relationship with God, one where they were called to live according to his standards. It's a reminder that true freedom, like the freedom the Israelites had just experienced, comes with responsibility. The commandments weren't meant to restrict them, but to set them free to live lives that reflected God's holiness. For us, they continue to serve as a guide, challenging us to live in a way that honors both God and others. The Israelites' journey through the desert wasn't just about reaching the promised land. It was a time of testing, growth, and transformation. After witnessing the incredible miracles of God, from the plagues in Egypt to the parting of the Red Sea, the Israelites still struggled with faith and obedience. Their time in the desert stretched out to 40 years, largely due to their repeated complaints, doubts, and disobedience. This period shows us that even when we know the path, it's easy to lose sight of the destination if we let fear and frustration take over. During their wandering, God provided for the Israelites in miraculous ways. When they were hungry, He sent manna from heaven. When they were thirsty, He brought water from a rock. These daily provisions were a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, God takes care of His people. It's like being in a difficult season of life, feeling lost or uncertain, yet seeing small blessings that sustain you. The desert experience teaches us the importance of trusting in God's timing and provision, even when we can't see the end of the journey. However, the Israelites often let their frustrations get the best of them. They complained about the food, they doubted God's ability to lead them, and at one point, they even longed to return to Egypt. It's easy to look at their actions and wonder how they could doubt God after all He had done for them. But don't we do the same? When life gets tough, it's tempting to look back at the past or seek quick fixes rather than trusting the process. The wandering in the desert is a reminder that growth often comes through perseverance, even when the path seems long and uncertain. Despite their struggles, the desert was also a place of preparation. God used this time to shape His people, teaching them reliance, obedience, and trust. The journey wasn't just about getting to the promised land. It was about becoming the kind of people who could live there. In the same way, when we face seasons of waiting or wandering in our own lives, it's often because we're being prepared for something greater. The desert may be uncomfortable, but it's also where we grow stronger, where our faith is tested and refined. After years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites finally stood at the edge of the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, rich in resources and opportunity. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to their ancestors, a place where they could settle, prosper, and build a nation under God's guidance. But entering the promised land wasn't as simple as crossing the border. The land was occupied by powerful nations, and the Israelites faced the daunting task of conquering it. This teaches us that even when we reach the threshold of our goals, there are often challenges that require faith, courage, and perseverance. Joshua, Moses' successor, led the Israelites into the promised land, beginning with the famous Battle of Jericho. God's instructions to march around the city for 7 days, with priests blowing trumpets, must have seemed strange. But Joshua and the people followed God's command without question, and on the 7th day, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. This miraculous victory was a powerful reminder that success in life doesn't always come through conventional means. Sometimes it's about trusting God's unconventional plans. Have you ever had to take a step of faith that didn't make sense to others, only to see it work out in ways you couldn't have imagined? The conquest of Canaan wasn't completed overnight. The Israelites had to fight battle after battle, relying on God's guidance and strength. This period of conquest reminds us that even when we are walking in God's promises, there are obstacles to overcome. Whether it's overcoming personal fears, navigating relationships, or pursuing dreams, the promised land doesn't come without effort. The story of Joshua and the Israelites encourages us to persist, to take each step in faith, knowing that God is with us in every battle. But the promised land wasn't just about physical territory. It was about spiritual inheritance. God had called the Israelites to be a holy people, set apart to reflect His glory. Living in the promised land was meant to be a reflection of their relationship with God, a place where they could thrive by following His commandments and living in community. The land itself was a gift, but it came with the responsibility to live according to God's ways. For us, this speaks to the idea that the blessings we receive in life often come with a call to stewardship and faithfulness. It's not just about what we gain, but how we live in response to the gifts we're given. After settling in the promised land, The Israelites went through a period where they were led by judges, leaders raised up by God to guide and protect them during times of crisis. The judges were not kings or elected officials, but individuals called to leadership in times of need, often in response to the Israelites turning away from God. This cycle of rebellion, oppression, repentance, and deliverance defines much of the era of the judges. It's a story that reminds us of the consequences of drifting from our values and the power of repentance to bring us back on track. One of the most famous judges was Deborah, a woman of incredible wisdom and courage. As a prophetess and leader, she guided the Israelites to victory against their enemies. Deborah's story is a powerful example of how God uses people, regardless of gender or background, to lead and inspire. Her leadership, alongside Barak, in the defeat of Sisera's army, shows that true strength comes from faith and obedience to God's direction. It's a lesson in the unexpected. God often raises up leaders who defy societal expectations, reminding us that anyone can be called to make a difference. Another well-known judge was Gideon, who, despite his initial doubts and insecurities, led a small army to defeat the mighty Midianites. Gideon's story speaks to the theme of overcoming fear and trusting in God's plan, even when it seems impossible. God whittled down Gideon's army to just 300 men, ensuring that the victory could only be attributed to divine intervention. How often do we feel unqualified or unprepared for the challenges we face? Gideon's journey teaches us that when we rely on God's strength instead of our own, we can accomplish far more than we ever imagined. The cycle of the judges culminated in the story of Samson, a man known for his extraordinary physical strength, but also for his personal weaknesses. Samson's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and disobedience. While he achieved great victories for Israel, his downfall came through his relationship with Delilah, who betrayed him by cutting his hair, the source of his strength. Samson's life reminds us that even the most gifted among us can fall if we aren't careful to stay aligned with God's will. Yet, in his final act, Samson called on God one last time, using his strength to defeat Israel's enemies. His story shows that even in our failures, redemption is always possible. Samson's story is one of immense strength, not just physical, but also the strength of calling and purpose, though his life serves as a warning of how easily that strength can be undermined by personal weaknesses. From birth, Samson was set apart as a Nazirite, dedicated to God with specific vows, including never cutting his hair. His incredible strength allowed him to perform heroic feats, such as slaying a lion with his bare hands and defeating entire armies. Yet Samson's story also highlights the inner conflict that many of us face, having the gifts to do great things, but struggling with temptations that threaten to derail us. Samson's downfall came in the form of Delilah, a woman he fell deeply in love with. Delilah was approached by the Philistine rulers, who offered her a substantial reward to discover the secret of Samson's strength. After several attempts, Delilah eventually succeeded in coaxing Samson into revealing that his strength was tied to his uncut hair. In a moment of vulnerability, Samson allowed his guard to drop, and Delilah betrayed him. This moment serves as a powerful lesson. No matter how strong we are in certain areas, unchecked vulnerabilities can lead to our downfall. It's a reminder to be cautious of where we place our trust. Once Samson's hair was cut, his strength left him, and he was captured by the Philistines. Blinded and humiliated, Samson was taken as a prisoner, a shadow of his former self. But even in his lowest moment, Samson's faith was not entirely gone. As he stood in the Philistine temple, with his hands bound between two pillars, he prayed one final time for strength. God granted his request, and Samson used his restored power to bring down the temple, killing himself and the Philistines. It's a tragic yet redemptive moment, showing that even in our greatest failures, God can still use us for his purposes. Samson and Delilah's story reminds us that strength, whether physical, mental, or spiritual, is a gift that must be stewarded carefully. God granted his request, and Samson used his restored power to bring down the temple, killing himself and the Philistines. It's a tragic yet redemptive moment, showing that even in our greatest failures, God can still use us for his purposes. Samson and Delilah's story reminds us that strength, whether physical, mental, or spiritual, is a gift that must be stewarded carefully. Samson's failure wasn't in his lack of power. It was in his inability to control his desires and discern the motives of those around him. For us, it's a lesson in recognizing our vulnerabilities and staying grounded in the purpose God has for us. Samson's life may have been marked by missteps, but his final act of faith shows that redemption is always within reach, even in the darkest moments. Samuel holds a unique place in the Bible as both the last judge of Israel and the prophet who anointed its first kings. His story begins with a remarkable prayer from his mother, Hannah, who was barren and desperately pleaded with God for a child. When her prayer was answered, she dedicated Samuel to God's service, fulfilling a promise to raise him in the temple. From a young age, Samuel's life was marked by divine encounters, including one where God called him audibly as a child. His story reminds us that no matter how young or old we are, we can be used for significant purposes when we are open to hearing God's voice. As Samuel grew, he became a respected prophet and judge, guiding Israel through difficult times. He was known for his integrity and his deep commitment to God's commands. Samuel's leadership was especially vital during a time of transition for Israel. The people, looking at the nations around them, began demanding a king to lead them, wanting to be like other nations rather than a people led directly by God. Samuel, heartbroken by their request, warned them that a king would bring both benefits and burdens. But the people persisted. This moment highlights a common human tendency: to seek what seems popular or powerful, even when it's not aligned with God's best for us. Despite his personal reservations, Samuel obeyed God's instruction to anoint a king, beginning with Saul. His role as the prophet who anointed both Saul and later David shows the deep connection between spiritual leadership and political leadership in Israel. Samuel was the one who not only anointed kings but also held them accountable to God's standards. His confrontation with Saul, after the king's disobedience, is a pivotal moment where Samuel declares that God values obedience over sacrifice. This interaction speaks volumes about the importance of following God's directions, rather than relying on outward appearances or rituals. Samuel's story is a reminder of the delicate balance between spiritual guidance and the pull of worldly desires. As the last judge, he represented the era when Israel was led directly by God, but his anointing of the kings marked the shift toward a monarchy. His life shows us the importance of discernment, obedience, and faithfulness, even when the world around us pushes for something different. Samuel remained a steadfast figure, committed to God's will, and through his leadership, the foundation for Israel's future was laid. Saul's rise to kingship marked a turning point in Israel's history. The people, wanting to be like the nations around them, demanded a king to lead them into battle and rule over them. God instructed Samuel to anoint Saul, a man who stood out physically, tall, strong, and seemingly fit for leadership. At first glance, Saul appeared to be the perfect king. He started his reign with humility, even hiding among the baggage when he was first called to be king. His early victories in battle gained him favor with the people, and it seemed that Israel had found its leader. But Saul's story is a warning about how quickly power can corrupt when it isn't rooted in obedience to God. Despite his promising start, Saul's reign began to unravel when he repeatedly disobeyed God's instructions. One of the pivotal moments came when Saul, impatient and fearful before a battle, offered a sacrifice that only Samuel, as a priest, was permitted to perform. This act of disobedience showed Saul's lack of trust in God's timing and his growing pride. How often do we, like Saul, rush ahead of God's plans because we're impatient or afraid? His actions remind us that good intentions don't excuse disobedience. Obedience, even in moments of uncertainty, is what God values most. Saul's downfall continued when he failed to follow God's command to completely destroy the Amalekites and their possessions. Instead, he kept the best of the livestock, justifying his disobedience by claiming he intended to sacrifice them to God. This moment led to Samuel's famous declaration, "To obey is better than sacrifice." It was a turning point in Saul's reign, as Samuel informed him that because of his disobedience, God had rejected him as king. Saul's reign is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to justify our actions, even when they clearly go against what we know is right. As Saul's grip on power began to slip, he became increasingly paranoid and unstable, especially after David entered the scene. David's rise in popularity and success in battle fueled Saul's jealousy, and his reign spiraled into a tragic obsession with trying to kill David. This final chapter of Saul's life is a reminder of how unchecked emotions, jealousy, pride, and fear can lead to self-destruction. Saul's story shows that leadership and success mean little if they aren't grounded in obedience and humility before God. In the end, Saul's legacy was one of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential, a king who began with promise but lost his way. The story of David and Goliath is one of the most well-known and inspiring tales of courage and faith. David, a young shepherd, wasn't a warrior by any means. Yet when the giant Goliath, a seasoned warrior from the Philistines, taunted the Israelites for 40 days, no one dared to challenge him until David stepped forward. Armed only with a sling and 5 smooth stones, David's confidence didn't come from his own abilities but from his faith in God. This story teaches us that sometimes the greatest battles in life aren't won by physical strength or worldly power, but by faith and trust in something greater. Goliath was intimidating, standing over 9 feet tall and clad in heavy armor. His presence alone paralyzed the Israelite army with fear, but David saw things differently. Where others saw an unbeatable giant, David saw an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. He famously declared, "The battle is the Lord's," reminding us that when we face our own giants, whether it's fear, doubt, or seemingly insurmountable challenges, victory doesn't depend on our strength, but on God's ability to work through us. When David approached Goliath, the giant mocked him, ridiculing the idea that such a young and inexperienced boy could be a threat. But David's faith didn't waver. With 1 stone, he struck Goliath on the forehead, and the giant fell. This wasn't just a physical victory, it was a spiritual one. David's victory over Goliath symbolized the triumph of faith over fear, of God's power over human strength. In our own lives, how often do we let fear stop us from facing the giants that stand in our way? David's story reminds us that with faith, no challenge is too great. David's defeat of Goliath marked the beginning of his rise to prominence in Israel. Though still young, this victory showcased David's courage, leadership, and trust in God, qualities that would later define his reign as king. The story of David and Goliath isn't just about an underdog defeating a giant, it's about trusting in God's plan, even when it seems impossible. It's a reminder that no matter how big the obstacles in front of us may seem, faith can move mountains, and with God on our side, we can overcome even the most daunting challenges. David's journey from shepherd to king is one of the most remarkable transformations in the Bible. After his victory over Goliath, David became a national hero, and his reputation as a skilled warrior and a man after God's own heart grew. But his rise to the throne was anything but easy. King Saul, consumed by jealousy, saw David as a threat and sought to kill him, forcing David to live as a fugitive for years. Despite these trials, David never sought revenge against Saul, even when given the opportunity. His respect for God's anointed leadership showed his deep sense of honor and trust in God's timing. David's eventual rise to kingship was a fulfillment of God's promise, but it also marked a new chapter for Israel. As king, David united the tribes of Israel and established Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center of the nation. His leadership brought peace, prosperity, and expansion to Israel. David wasn't just a warrior. He was also a poet and a musician, known for writing many of the Psalms. His deep connection with God permeated his leadership, and his reign was marked by a desire to build a kingdom that honored God. In many ways, David exemplifies the balance between strength and humility, showing that true leadership comes from a heart aligned with God. However, David's reign wasn't without flaws. One of the most significant moments of failure came in his affair with Bathsheba and the subsequent murder of her husband, Uriah, to cover up the sin. This event marked a turning point in David's life, showing that even the greatest leaders are not immune to temptation and failure. But what makes David's story unique is his response to his sin. When confronted by the prophet Nathan, David didn't deny or justify his actions. He repented. His heartfelt plea for forgiveness in Psalm 51 stands as one of the most powerful examples of repentance in the Bible, reminding us that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is always available if we truly seek it. David's legacy as king is one of complexity. He was both a man after God's own heart and a flawed human being. But through it all, his life points to the importance of humility, repentance, and reliance on God's mercy. David's reign paved the way for the eventual rise of his descendant, Jesus, fulfilling the covenant that God made with him, that his line would endure forever. David's story reminds us that leadership is not about being perfect, but about staying connected to God's heart, even through the highs and lows of life. The Ark of the Covenant held a significant place in Israel's history, representing the very presence of God among his people. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a sacred object that housed the tablets of the Ten Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. These items reminded the Israelites of God's covenant and provision throughout their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. When David became king, one of his first major acts was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This decision wasn't just about uniting the nation, it was about establishing Jerusalem as the spiritual heart of Israel, where God's presence would dwell. The journey of bringing the Ark to Jerusalem was not without its challenges. When the Ark was initially being transported, one of David's men, Uzzah, touched it to steady it and was struck dead. This tragic event showed the seriousness of approaching God's holiness with the proper reverence. David was initially shaken by this, and for a time, the Ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom. However, when David saw that God was blessing Obed-Edom's household, he realized the importance of bringing the Ark into the city with proper respect. This part of the story teaches us about the balance between God's holiness and his desire to be with his people. When the Ark finally entered Jerusalem, it was a moment of great celebration. David, filled with joy, danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing only a linen ephod. This act of uninhibited worship showed David's deep reverence and love for God. It also demonstrated that true worship isn't about appearances or formality, it's about the heart. David's wife, Michal, criticized him for what she saw as undignified behavior. But David's response was clear. His worship was for God alone. This moment challenges us to consider how we approach worship. Are we concerned with how others perceive us? Or are we focused on giving God the praise he deserves? The arrival of the Ark in Jerusalem marked a new chapter in Israel's spiritual life. It symbolized God's presence being fully established in the heart of the nation, and it set the stage for the construction of the temple, where the Ark would later reside. For us today, the Ark serves as a powerful reminder that God's presence isn't confined to a physical object, but is with us always, guiding and protecting us. It also calls us to approach God with reverence, while also experiencing the freedom and joy that come with worshiping him wholeheartedly. Solomon, the son of David, is remembered for his wisdom, wealth, and the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. When Solomon became king, he inherited a united and prosperous Israel, thanks to the efforts of his father. But Solomon's reign was defined by a different kind of achievement. He was tasked with building the temple, a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant and a central place of worship for the people of Israel. The construction of the temple was a monumental task, not just because of its size and splendor, but because of what it represented: God's presence among his people. The temple was a magnificent structure, designed with intricate detail and built using the finest materials. Solomon spared no expense, importing cedar wood from Lebanon, gold, silver, and precious stones to make the temple a place of beauty and reverence. This wasn't just about creating an impressive building. It was about honoring God with the best of what Israel had to offer. It's a powerful reminder that in our own lives, when we give to God, whether it's our time, resources, or talents, we should do so with excellence, giving him our very best. When the temple was completed, Solomon held a grand dedication ceremony. As the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple, the glory of the Lord filled the space in the form of a cloud. This divine presence was so overwhelming that the priests couldn't even stand to minister. It was a profound moment that affirmed God's acceptance of the temple as his dwelling place among his people. Solomon's prayer during the dedication is one of humility and recognition that, while the temple was a physical space, no building could truly contain the fullness of God. It's a reminder that while we seek to honor God in tangible ways, his presence goes beyond what we can see or build. Solomon's wisdom and leadership brought peace and prosperity to Israel, but the temple was his crowning achievement. It became the spiritual center of the nation, where sacrifices were made and people came to worship. However, Solomon's reign also serves as a cautionary tale. Despite his wisdom, later in life, Solomon's heart was turned away from God due to his many foreign wives and their influence. This shift led to idolatry and eventually contributed to the division of the kingdom after his death. The story of Solomon and the temple reminds us of the importance of staying faithful to God, even after achieving great success. It's not just about what we build, but about maintaining a heart that remains true to Him. After Solomon's death, the unified kingdom of Israel was plunged into turmoil. Despite the grandeur of Solomon's reign and the glory of the temple, his later years were marked by spiritual decline. Solomon's many marriages to foreign women led him to worship other gods, which set the stage for God's judgment on Israel. His son, Rehoboam, inherited the throne, but his harsh policies and refusal to lighten the heavy burdens placed on the people led to a revolt. This moment of division wasn't just political, it was a spiritual turning point for the nation, showing the consequences of drifting away from God's commands. The kingdom split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel, led by Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom of Judah, ruled by Rehoboam. This division marked the beginning of a long period of instability and conflict. Jeroboam, in an attempt to consolidate his power, set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan to prevent the people of the northern kingdom from traveling to Jerusalem to worship. This act of idolatry set the northern kingdom on a path away from God, leading to its eventual downfall. It's a reminder that when leaders make decisions based on fear and control rather than faith and obedience, the consequences can be far-reaching. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, the temple in Jerusalem remained the center of worship, and the line of David continued. However, even Judah faced its share of spiritual decline, with some kings leading the people closer to God and others leading them into idolatry. The division of the kingdom created a fractured Israel, one that struggled with internal strife, external threats, and spiritual confusion. This period teaches us about the importance of unity and the dangers of compromise. When we allow pride, fear, or idolatry to guide our actions, division often follows. Despite the chaos of the divided kingdom, God remained faithful to His covenant with David. Prophets like Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah were sent to call the people back to repentance, warning them of the consequences of their disobedience, but also offering hope of restoration. The division of the kingdom may have seemed like a final break, but it was part of a larger narrative of God's plan to redeem and restore His people. Even in the midst of division and conflict, God's promise to David that his line would endure forever remained, pointing toward the future coming of the Messiah. During the period of the divided kingdom, God raised up prophets to speak His word to the people. These prophets weren't just fortune tellers, they were messengers sent by God to guide, warn, and encourage His people in times of moral and spiritual crisis. Some of the most well-known prophets include Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, each of whom played a critical role in calling the people back to faithfulness. Their messages were often difficult, confronting the people with their sins, but they also offered hope for redemption and restoration if the people turned back to God. Elijah is one of the most dramatic figures among the prophets. His confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel is a powerful example of standing up for truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. When the people of Israel were torn between worshiping God and following the false god Baal, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to call fire from heaven. When they failed, Elijah prayed, and God sent fire to consume his sacrifice, proving His power and sovereignty. Elijah's courage teaches us that even when we feel like we're standing alone, God is with us, and His power is greater than anything the world can throw at us. Isaiah, often called the messianic prophet, spoke extensively about the coming of the Messiah and the future hope for Israel. His prophecies include vivid descriptions of the suffering servant who would take on the sins of the world and bring salvation. Isaiah's message of hope in the midst of judgment reveals the heart of God. Though His people had turned away, He was always working toward their redemption. This theme of hope runs through all the prophetic books, showing that no matter how far we stray, God's plan for restoration is never far behind. Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, lived through the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. His life was marked by personal suffering and rejection as he delivered God's message of impending judgment. Yet, even in the darkest times, Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant that God would make with his people, a covenant written on their hearts. His story reminds us that even when everything seems lost, God is still at work, bringing about his purposes. Jeremiah's perseverance in the face of constant opposition is a testament to faithfulness. Even when the message we carry isn't popular, the prophets were more than just voices of judgment. They were also voices of hope. They called the people to repentance, warning of the consequences of sin, but they also spoke of God's enduring love and his plan to restore his people. The prophetic books remind us that even in the midst of our own failures, God's grace is always available. The prophets pointed to a future where the brokenness of the world would be healed, ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. Their messages challenge us to live with both urgency and hope, knowing that God's promises are sure. The Babylonian exile was a dark and painful chapter in Israel's history. After years of warnings from prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, the people of Judah faced the consequences of their disobedience and idolatry. In 586 B.C., the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried many of the people into exile. This event wasn't just a political or military defeat, it was a spiritual crisis for the people of Judah. Their homeland was gone. The temple lay in ruins, and they found themselves in a foreign land, far from the place where they believed God's presence resided. The exile was a time of deep reflection and sorrow for the Israelites. Many felt abandoned by God, questioning how this disaster could happen to them as God's chosen people. But even in exile, God was still at work. Prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel emerged, bringing messages of hope and reassurance that God had not forgotten his people. Ezekiel, in particular, had a vision of a valley of dry bones, symbolizing the nation of Israel. In this vision, God breathed new life into the bones, showing that he would restore Israel, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. It's a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, God can bring about new life and restoration. During the exile, the Israelites had to find new ways to worship and maintain their identity as God's people. Without the temple, they developed new practices, such as gathering in synagogues to study the scriptures and pray. This period of exile became a time of spiritual renewal for many, as they sought to understand what it meant to follow God in a foreign land. It's a lesson in resilience. Sometimes, when we lose what's familiar, we discover new depths of faith and purpose. The exile teaches us that even when everything around us seems to fall apart, God is still present, guiding us through the uncertainty. The exile lasted for 70 years, but it wasn't the end of the story. God's promise of restoration remained, and through prophets like Jeremiah, the people were told that they would return to their homeland. This return was not just about going back to a physical place, it was about spiritual renewal. The Babylonian exile serves as a powerful reminder that, though there may be seasons of judgment and hardship, God's plans for redemption never waver. Just as he brought the Israelites back to Jerusalem, he works in our lives to restore and rebuild, even after seasons of loss or exile. After 70 long years of captivity in Babylon, the time came for the Israelites to return to their homeland. This return was made possible by King Cyrus of Persia, who, after conquering Babylon, issued a decree allowing the exiles to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Just as he brought the Israelites back to Jerusalem, he works in our lives to restore and rebuild, even after seasons of loss or exile. After 70 long years of captivity in Babylon, the time came for the Israelites to return to their homeland. This return was made possible by King Cyrus of Persia, who, after conquering Babylon, issued a decree allowing the exiles to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The return from exile was a moment of hope and renewal, but it was also a time of significant challenges. The Israelites were going back to a land that had been devastated, and the task of rebuilding, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, was enormous. However, their return was a fulfillment of God's promise, showing that no matter how long the exile, God's plans for restoration are always at work. Led by figures like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the returning exiles faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only the city, but also their relationship with God. Zerubbabel took charge of reconstructing the temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. This second temple, though less grand than Solomon's, was a powerful symbol of God's continued presence with his people. Ezra, a priest and scribe, focused on restoring the spiritual life of the community. By reintroducing the law of Moses, he led the people in confession and recommitment to God's covenant, reminding them of their identity as God's chosen people. Nehemiah's leadership was crucial in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, providing security and a sense of stability for the people. His story is a lesson in perseverance and faithfulness. Despite opposition from surrounding nations and internal strife, Nehemiah pressed on, organizing the people and completing the walls in just 52 days. Nehemiah's determination and reliance on God show that when we face overwhelming tasks, we can find strength through faith and community. The rebuilding of the walls wasn't just about protecting the city, it was about restoring the heart of a nation. The return from exile was not just about physical restoration, but also spiritual renewal. The people had to confront their past mistakes, acknowledging how their disobedience had led to their exile in the first place. But through this process, they rediscovered their purpose as God's people. It was a time of reestablishing their identity and renewing their covenant with God. The return from exile is a powerful reminder that even after periods of hardship, God always offers a path to renewal. It's a story of hope, that no matter how broken things seem, with faith, perseverance, and obedience, restoration is always possible. The ongoing theme of redemption runs throughout the Old Testament, culminating in the messianic promises that point toward the coming of Jesus. From the moment sin entered the world through Adam and Eve, God's plan for redemption was already in motion. Throughout the stories of the Old Testament, from the fall of man, the flood, and the Exodus, to the exile and return, God was constantly working to bring his people back into a relationship with him. Each event, each covenant, was a step toward the ultimate act of redemption that would be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The sacrifices, laws, and rituals that were established under Moses were not the end of the story, but a foreshadowing of the perfect sacrifice to come. The prophets often spoke of a future Redeemer, a Messiah who would bring salvation not just to Israel but to all nations. This promise of redemption gave hope to God's people, even in their darkest moments. Whether it was in the wilderness or during the exile, it's a reminder that no matter how far we stray or how broken we feel, God's plan for redemption is always at work, and it is far bigger than our immediate circumstances. The return from exile was a physical representation of God's promise to restore his people, but it also pointed toward a deeper spiritual restoration. The prophets spoke of a time when God's law would be written on the hearts of his people, not just on tablets of stone. This new covenant, as foretold by Jeremiah, was a promise of a deeper relationship with God, one that would be made possible through the coming of Jesus. The Old Testament ends with a sense of anticipation, a longing for the fulfillment of the promises, for the coming of the Messiah who would redeem not only Israel but all of humanity. Reflecting on the entire history of the Old Testament, we see that redemption isn't just about individual salvation, it's about God's plan to restore all of creation. Every story, every prophecy, points to the need for a Savior and the lengths to which God will go to redeem his people. The messianic promises woven throughout the Old Testament remind us that redemption is not just about the past. It's an ongoing process that continues to this day. The story of redemption invites us to reflect on our own journey, to recognize our need for God's grace, and to embrace the hope that comes from his promise of restoration. As we've journeyed through the entire history of the Old Testament, one thing becomes clear. God's plan for redemption has always been at the heart of every story, every challenge, and every victory. But what does that mean for you today? The message woven throughout the Old Testament is that redemption isn't just for the people of ancient Israel. It's for you, here and now. The same God who parted the Red Sea, brought down the walls of Jericho, and led his people through the wilderness is still at work in your life, guiding, restoring, and calling you to something greater. So, what will you do with all this knowledge? Will you let it inspire you to make a change, to live with more purpose and faith? The lessons of the Old Testament aren't just about history, they're about how we live our lives every day. Do you have your own giants to face, like David did with Goliath? Are you wandering in a desert season, waiting for direction? Or perhaps you're standing at the edge of your own promised land, ready to take the next step but unsure of what comes next. The stories of the Old Testament show us that no matter where you are, God's promises are always true, and His guidance is always available. Now that you've seen how the entire Old Testament fits together, it's time to apply that wisdom. Take what you've learned and start making changes in your own life. What battles are you fighting that require faith over fear? What promises are you waiting for that need patience and perseverance? The answers are in front of you, and the Old Testament offers a roadmap for navigating life's challenges with trust and hope. Before you go, I want to encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep seeking God's truth in every part of your life. If this journey through the Old Testament has opened your eyes to new possibilities, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you never miss out on the next step in your spiritual growth. Let's keep walking this journey together. There's so much more to discover, and the best is yet to come.